Why question love's purpose before discussing its fount? Is not the purpose of love bound to that absolute sense? Is love not realized by a particular sense of itself, to its point of origin? The purpose of love is not intuited, but that which is made by its hand as love realizes itself. The realization of true love is composed by the measuring of need against the presence of the all-subordinating territory that demands nothing but subservience to a particular consciousness. Love mobilizes in its own context as a formation of consciousness and a new state of being. It is not only possible but necessary to maintain a stance on hope as a markedly determinate and necessary way of being, even after confronting the self-imposed limits of the gospel of prosperity in capitalist production alongside the revolutionary failures of the 20th century. The determination that what I will to be is worth willing into a world that declares itself already complete remains pressing for the construction of the not yet. In a series of destabilizing encounters that affirmed negativity and traced new paths towards some previously unseen outside, the revival of camaraderie is discovered despite itself. And it is this refounded concern with freedom that brings us to the concerns of a utopia, powered by its own absence, precisely because it is uttered in hopelessness.
Do you want me to lead us in?
Sure, if you don't mind.
To articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. For historical materialism, it is a question of holding fast to a picture of the past, just as if it had unexpectedly thrust itself in a moment of danger on the historical subject. The danger threatens the stock of tradition as much as its recipients. For both, it is one and the same, handing itself over as the tool of the ruling classes. In every epoch, the attempt must be made to deliver tradition anew from the conformism which is on the point of overwhelming it. For the Messiah arrives not merely as the Redeemer, he also arrives as the vanquisher of the Antichrist. The only writer of history with the gift of setting alight the spark of hope in the past is the one who is convinced of this, that not even the dead will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. I suppose a good place to start is then, what are your, given what you're currently writing about, what is your sort of initial response to the famous thesis from on the philosophy of history?
What I find so interesting and motivating about this messianic character in not just Benjamin's thought, but in the general context of a lot of the people we cite in these conversations that we have, firmly within some kind of a Marxist tradition, but is versed in the language and the in theology, because the questions that arise from this problematizing of history in order to potentially make it exists within this sort of like problem of ontology, in this discretion in the divine states of living, which often represent very extremes of actual possibility for creating new things in the world. So at the end of the day, history and theology, which, like, if you know anything about me personally, my whole considering my whole background, people are like, well, of course, those are the two things that you're interested in placing in conversation with one another. But I really do believe that it goes further than mere sort of like bearing witness in experience, but how all of that has the potential to configure itself into a way of thinking about how the world works that includes the past, the present, and also the potential for how things could be cohered in one particular object, in this case, an object of thought. But it's not always just about the thought-based object, but sometimes it's about actuality and action. Sometimes the sort of manner of thinking through history leads itself to the sort of necessary attributes of action in the world that allow the sort of persistence of death to be re-overcome, as it was in the case of my primary influence in thinking through the world theologically is from Christianity, and thinking through death and the resurrection as not this like that death was overcome in the particular dispensation of the resurrection, rather than as this process or this occurrence that persists into the contemporary day. And so as such, death is not this all-encompassing, bottomless, like, you know, this empty thing that we bear witness to, and but that we allow the burden to ultimately be borne by these very fixed perceptions of the end of the world, if you will, heaven and hell. That this perceptions of these two ideas do have a discrete nature, and that divinity is about its stark presence and absence, and the categories that rise from this distinct place, rather than at the same time, you know, talking about the coming dispensation or the immediacy of a dispensation of Jesus, or the lack thereof, even in some sort of theological cases, that involves all of this like work, all of this like miraculous commandment and this work that suggests that death being overcome is the introduction of new possibility continuously in the world, rather than as this like history as articulated in this theological sense and in a Marxist sense too, which, you know, I'm sure we'll get to. Like, it takes on a new character, and all of a sudden, like, you can, you know, accuse me of some kind of presentism or whatever, but like, it's, I don't know, it's just a different way of sort of thinking through historical ideas that.
Well, to kind of like pick up on that question of presentism, is the problem of a kind of like overly teleological Marxism, and actually the same problem shared by a sort of liberal capitalist historiography, which is to insinuate that the present is in some way a kind of like coherent category, right? Because really this isn't a reduction of everything to the now, right? But actually a sort of an exploding of the now, so that the fundamental incompleteness of its very nature can be thoroughly understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that tracks in, I think, the same sense. Like, a lot of this is stemming from this kind of Blockian idea that Christianity offers the necessary criticism of, in that it brings a collection, ultimately synthetic collection. Sorry to do biblical heresies on Maine. Ultimately, a synthetic collection that was cohered around an idea of a church, but that when when you bring a mirror up to it and you face it with itself, all of a sudden the idea of these ideas absent the divine sort of like father figure, its ideas around freedom come from its ability to confront itself, collapsing God into some broader categorization, not renouncing divinity, but recategorizing divinity or decategorizing it, I guess. It's predicated on a hermeneutic that is capable of doing this. So the Bible is most important because it's constantly having it in and of its existence is a claim staked to divinity. And as such, all of the various claims staked on biblical literature themselves have this, like, they give rise to this particular critique of themselves every time they do it. And often it's because of the main vehicles, like, of church and of state, this kind of weird post-capitalist affirmative evangelical Christianity people are familiar with, particularly really all over the world. I feel like the necessity to vanish God into the idea of Christianity, using Christianity itself, sounds like a weird art project, but that it's about our concern with good ways of being. And that at the end of the day, the persistence of categorizing ways of being that are about that rely on this absence or full presence, inexperienced full presence of God, and thus this, like, supreme distance between the world now as it is and what it could be, which at the end of the day is like a take on eschatology. All this is about. I was raised as an amillennialist, in the sense that, like, there is stake born in, like, what Jesus said to the disciples in the book of Luke, talking about the kingdom of God being among you. There's stake in the idea of the commandments to preach, and the kingdom of heaven is drawing near, so you should heal the sick and cleanse the leper and raise the dead, etc. Egizo, the kingdom of heaven is egizo, drawing near or at hand. You know, you've received divine grace with nothing being asked of you, and now you give it freely unto others as this, as Christ's ministry visits you,
as something inexhaustible. And, like, I think in everything you said, like in everything we say, right, we talk about this idea of utopia a lot, and we talk about this idea, of, like, heaven and hell. And I think the common thread that unites a kind of Blockian Marxist and, atheist Christianity read on those three concepts is that they are not spatially or geographically determined, right? The great kind of political theology of going, like, heaven is the state after is a deferment of the kingdom of God, right? It's the deferment of that which is both with an active process that is, like, within and at hand into a kind of, like, beyond the horizon of possibility. And I think this is not just a kind of non-materialist theological point, right? But directly connects to a kind of Marxist understanding of, like, class consciousness and revolutionary potential as not being something. Class consciousness is not like the kind of eschatology that will just kind of arrive one day. It is. Bloch saw this very clearly, that this is what connects, but the revolutionary potential of the global communist movement and Christianity is that it is at hand. It is a kind of latent possibility within the present. And I think the idea of, actually, I remember one of the first things that me and you talked about, even before we started kind of making stuff together, was there's a clip, that Paul Ricoeur clip, this old video with Paul Ricoeur where he's asked a question about eternity. And I can't remember it exactly, but he talks about the possibility of eternity being something that is experienced now. There are moments that seem kind of like outside of time. There are moments at which kind of like the course of there are moments at which the kind of, like, capital E event happens, and there is something incredibly sort of isolating and atomizing and sad about this vision of a heaven as being a solely non-materialist point that has an eschatology that is never really going to arrive, but is always still, exists always in the future tense, that which is still to come. And I think the kind of value of understanding Bloch's point about utopia, and the reason why he and so many other kind of Marxists have thought so deeply about Christianity specifically, is that heaven is not a state that will arrive, but it is a thing which is always arriving. The Messiah is always arriving, right?
Yeah, there's this like really offensive, for lack of a better term, demoting of the attributes of fucking divine grace in this like idea that like, okay, everything that is good and holy is other and immaterial and unrelatable and immeasurable, and everything that is good and affirmative of the imminence of grace in the world after the sort of like most important, according to this particular set of ideas, the most important event, thus far in the history of humanity, is so ultimately the distance between us and that is manifested in the worship of our own personal and social austerity. That's the imminence and affirmation of divine fucking grace is social austerity. Like, and it's this like, it's this important part of what we were talking about earlier. This confrontation of impossibility with, possibility, that, or it's immediately sort of like reintroducing, at the very least, this realization of the opening up of grace, truth, and love.
I mean, isn't this what Benjamin talks about when he says that like historicism culminates in a sort of universal history, right? This kind of like unalterable time. Yeah. And I really love Benjamin's line that the historical materialist cannot do without the concept of a present which is not a transition. And I was thinking about what you were saying about the concept of death earlier, and this idea of like death no longer being considered this, this ultimate kind of void, right? But actually, Benjamin talks about this elsewhere, this kind of responsibility towards the dead, right? The vindication of the struggles of the dead is a kind of resurrection, right? This idea of like recapitulating and restaging the revolutionary struggles of the past, which is like a classic Marxist conception, is a way of kind of resurrecting those struggles, of seeking to find justification for them in the present. And it's like there is an inexhaustibility to all of those practical details of, go feed the sick, free the prisoners, forgive debt. And as a program of political theology, there is, utopia does not arrive. It is kind of, imminent to the very condition of coming to self-consciousness, coming to revolutionary self-consciousness.
It's 1661 in the colony of Jamestown, and two indentured servants called Isaac Friend and William Clutton began a conspiracy to recruit, quote, a matter of 40 and get arms. After talks of a petition to address the problem of a lack of proper nutrition among servants dissolved into whispers of rebellion and liberty free from bondage by the men who belonged to James Goodwin, a plantation owner and eventual Speaker of the House of Burgesses, who kept his human property fed on a diet of water and cornbread, when even the Great Charter of Privileges specifies 3 days a week of meat for head-right servants. The plot, as we know it, was foiled and recounted via testimonial evidence shared between a few servants, Isaac Friend, who corroborated much of the story, but denied intent to carry things through, and an overseer for James Goodwin called John Park, who basically says things were going fine until William Clutton started yammering about contracts and meat thrice a week. Clutton was eventually arrested for sedition. The results of the arrest are lost to history. The proliferation of indentured servitude in the early modern world was the direct imagination of the mercantile experiments of 16th and 17th century Western Europe. The joint stock corporations colonizing the non-European world were an active inquiry into the profitability of established overseas economic ventures along the lines of East India, Muscovy, and Bermuda. And in 1607, the Virginia companies of London and Plymouth began the first steps toward permanent settlement along the eastern coast of North America. Active inquiry being a polite way of saying colonial economic ventures required enough buying power to stand around taking shots in the pitch black dark. But the belligerents in the Virginia Company's Colonial project took a series of rough starts and recharterizations over their early years that included things with names like the Starving Time, as well as physical conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy as the English colony began settling further along the James River and implementing liberal land policies in order to maximize the colony's agricultural profitability, while appeasing the wide-eyed London investors and impulses of the British Crown. Europe just got out of war, you see, that lasted for about 30 years, and it cost a lot of money. The resulting at least temporary economic depressions after the war, the jury is still out on the medium and long-term impacts, I think, but leave that to the historians, of high levels of unemployment for skilled and unskilled workers, of the results of struggles for sovereignty between increasingly centralized states and the landed aristocracy before it, saw the ambitions of wealthier colonists relegated to alternative means for addressing the way these problems spilled over into their colonial project, using the between 1/2 and 2/3 of immigrants who came to the colony during the 17th century as indentured servants, as the ultimate means to the end of their own economic experiment. In November of 1618, the Virginia Company, just 12 years after its chartering by James I and just 1 year before the establishment of the Virginia Assembly, convened to pass what became known as the Orders and Constitutions, a great charter of privileges, orders, and laws, which established the headright system. Are we flashing back to our high school history classes yet? A headright is a land reward for those involved in the successful transportation of the much-needed agricultural labor for colonial planters. Large acreage, 50 acres per head. Corruption, abuse, and widespread fraud ensued. It's very interesting. It saw the colony flooded with cheap labor to address England's growing competitiveness in the tobacco trade, their continued competition with Spain, and it put the Virginia colony on the path towards its first successes and instituted a set of labor relations that would dramatically affect the trajectory of the colony for the coming decades. The potential fractures in the bottom line undergirding the early modern colonial project manifested in conspiratorial thinking from both colonists and the indentured servants and slaves tending their tobacco. A conspiracy of servants along with conspiracy from the anxious imagination of the colonial elite and enslaving class. A relatively common occurring phenomenon that played a role in shaping the actions by free whites with regard to first indentured servants and African slaves soon later. In the minds of colonial elite, a form of retribution lurked close by, ready to strike when given the opportunity. New York, several weeks in the winter of 1741. Fires are breaking out around the city with a bustling slave economy, 1/5 of the total population the legal property of another human. And immediately there are talks of a, quote, villainous confederacy of latent enemies amongst us. Anxiety over retribution in the form of violent destruction of the social world gave rise to an invention of conspiracy that was used to brutalize and execute 30 black and 4 white New Yorkers by hanging and burning at the stake, displayed in public as to send a clear message against any real or imagined conspirators, and 100 more men and women locked in a dungeon under City Hall to coerce confessions that bear the same striking similarity and uniformity as the revolt itself to the tropics of white fear that saw the apocalypse in those fires. Those not the subject of explicit violence were deported in an effort to guarantee the hardest toil possible in the most punishing environments. All a clear fabrication, born from a long-standing fear of impossible retribution, fears that would continue into the next century as the newly forming United States hurtles unknowingly towards civil war. The Confessions of Nat Turner is one of the most important documents written since the 19th century. Turner's Confessions, not to be confused with the novel that shares the same name from the 1960s, which is an entirely different conversation, were transcribed by a defense attorney called Thomas Gray shortly before his trial and execution on November 11th in 1831. Gray's description of Turner's life and the rebellion he helped conspire is far from pure transcription. Gray is frank in his description of the events, as well as his personal feelings regarding Nat Turner's actions, beliefs, and disposition. With all this taken into account, Gray still manages to deliver some measure of presumable genuine documentation, and while any scholarly contention with this isn't worth getting into necessarily, I'm personally inclined to quote the historian Patrick Breen in stating that the most reasonable reading of this document is that Gray faithfully transmitted the confessions of America's most famous slave rebel. So then we are challenged with this narrative of slave resistance, the same way with other slave stories. The barrier of past is magnified by the primacy of white documentation in prevailing narrative forms, novelizations of slave revolts that serve as dumping ground for personal pathology, see the novel I mentioned earlier, and a determination to revert to the tropes and standards of prevailing structures of power. Turner went too far. There's always a comfortable middle. To grapple with this history rather than dismissing it as madness or heresy is itself violent. It sounds extreme when you put it that way, but when you've heard one take, you've heard them all. There is of course division over the legacy of the slave revolt, over Turner's efficacy, and thus the viability of his ideas, over violence as this neutralizing force, some kind of immovable object, what could easily be interpreted as an act of bravery, what Henry Louis Gates described as a prelude to the noble performance of some 200,000 black men who served so very courageously in the Civil War, the war that finally put an end to the evil institution that in 1860 chained some 3.9 million human beings to perpetual bondage, is actually, somehow, beyond accepted limits, subjected to the familiar double standard of state violence and warfare against its primary historical antagonists. The standardized interpretation itself a transcription of the past, but one that contours with an understanding of events we nestle into, comforted and unconfronted. We're so clever historians, with our hardline footnoting and institutional self-assuredness. Nat Turner as the automatic interlocking braking mechanism, flinching in hesitancy as it approaches too sharp a turn for our delicate and precise sensibilities. Conflicts over the legacy of slave revolts themselves, objective impasses that remain tucked away in universities to be tinkered with, spilling over into controversy in public history or education. The very inclusion of the slave minister, its own strange, heretic object. Does even the most radical among us not simply bear witness to Turner's struggle, as if to not contend with the necessary but not yet possible, or the primacy of a spiritual upheaval that refuses to abide by the conjectures of the state? Where are the public monuments to not just Turner's name, but his full conviction, his sense of eschatological urgency, his diagnostic power? Few seem to doubt Turner's sincerity, but what of his ministry? It's hard to doubt that consensus around Nat Turner's so-called madness remained central fixtures, yet this prophecy of a man on holy pilgrimage to change the course of history that we interpret through the words of others, this leader of peasants, renders as paradoxical cliché in our contemporary moment, yet still are persistent representations of possibility. The potential for redemption, freedom, and resurrection, the potential for the restoration of your body when it was removed of its skin and stripped of its parts and scattered in 100 directions, to miraculously come back together again in some other context. Must one treat the past as never capable of anything but being past? Might not the past inject itself into our here and now, precisely at moments in which it becomes recognizable and is recognized by us? Might it not at those moments become both enlivened by our recognition and enlivening of our recognition, of the interest we discover in the past precisely because it has managed to force recognition upon us? Divine grace visits intention with its own reverberation in the world after it drives the human hand to strike, provoking its own response. While rebellions fail, the present state of things remain extremely concerned by the entry of the divine into the freedom-seeking hands of the least. Nat Turner, who sought to correct after obtaining insight in the true nature of things through divine deliverance. What eminence of grace of which we are certainly unworthy, yet remains available to us. It's like the idea of utopia. I would argue, and I am arguing, I guess, like it needs to reemerge in the same way that other ideas about, other things reemerge in, not just as an ultimate idea, as the good place that doesn't exist, far off from, but that like to see it as something. Yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah, to see it as something that's historical, that an idea in and of itself that's historically contingent, but it's our inability to articulate it imbues it, I would argue, with this kind of divine character, and that divine character's ability to enact some element or measure of retribution without always necessarily articulating a position in and of that world and that place. And the bush that I'm beating around is I've been reading a lot about slave revolts recently, like I always do. The proposition of the confronting the synthetic limitations of the church and state in the United States with the sort of very like essence of with their greatest social ills, confronting the greatest social ills through or by the sort of synthetic measures of church and state in the time period. In the Civil War, in the years leading up to the Civil War, there's this sort of cosmic dialogue that exists in the result, from one hand, the reverberations of Haiti as this present the feeling of the present being induced by this event, this confrontation, and then that being articulated in the United States through Nat Turner, for example, in 1831. Funny enough, we're talking about an idea of utopia that heavily uses the idea of New Jerusalem in his articulation of utopia. And when Nat Turner was caught after the slave revolt, he was jailed in a place called Jerusalem in Southampton County. Which is this really like, the idea of prophecy lives and constantly surrounds people like Nat Turner, and then they remanifest themselves in places like Bleeding Kansas and then through Harper's Ferry. I guess what I'm trying to say is that these are the events that led up to the Civil War, and 800,000 people were about to die over a conflict, over the stoking of doubt and the existence of practices.
I think what you're hitting on is the kind of necessity of a return to make like maybe Bloch's first book of theology of both of and for revolution. It's about the kind of dialectical synthesis of the cold and warm streams of Marxism, right? Because it postulates that actually the world is still in the process of being made and remade, right? This idea that like those seemingly iron laws of, social austerity, of ontological impoverishment can be shattered is fundamentally both a theological and revolutionary political one. This is a translation from the beginning of Ernst Bloch's book, on Thomas Munsner, the Theologian of Revolution. The dead return. As in new doing, so in the new displaying of sense and conceived history, placed under the continuing effect of revolutionary concepts, driven to the legend and illuminated by it, becomes an unlosable function of its fullness of witness related to revolution and to apocalypse. It is not at all, as with Spengler, a decaying sequence of images, not at all, as with secularized Augustinianism, a fixed epic of progress and of salvation, but a hard, most endangered journey, suffering, wandering, searching for the hidden home full tragic disturbance, bursting with leaps, outbursts, lonely promises, discontinuously charged with the knowledge of light. So much of the historiography that prevailed and that was highly exalted was, in truth, what Sebastian Franke saw through, a ridiculous fable and a carnival spectacle, if not an outright work of the devil before God. But the deceased Thomas Munzner, and what his vision teaches us to speak about, already belong in themselves to the historical, philosophical, even transcendent order, a palimpsest, inscribed with the traits of the peasant's war, with the contemplations of another world at the bottom. So shine on us, because the state is the devil, but the freedom of the children of God is the substance. Make us luminous and strengthen us in the image of the rebel of Christ, Thomas Munzner. I wonder, how do you see your work then on kind of revivalism, on this this concept of a sort of materialist working out of these theopolitical concepts of like heaven? How do you see those connecting with something like Bloch's work on Munzner?
Bloch's writing about the Bible hinges on the idea that the Bible was the book of the peasants, presents a very interesting hermeneutic, or the potential for an interesting hermeneutic, I guess I should say. The very thing that preaches to the fundamental need, and as like, you know, the very audience of this work was purposefully kept from reading it. And then when they do read it, they find in its central critiques of the world around them the capacity for divine violence, which I think is is one of the most pressing sort of concerns of like this confrontation with, you know, at the time, of profoundly Christian society. A Christian critique of Christianity requires an assuredness and a mission and a right necessary to confront something as evil as slavery, or as, like, you know, the condition of a peasant in the early modern period.
I mean, this is again the other side of the equation, right? If heaven postulated as this kind of like far off, non-material, entirely spiritual plane, as a salve for the exploitations of the present, obfuscates the very fact that the same happens with hell. Hell becomes this other non-material, entirely spiritual place. When what is this if not hell, right? What is this? How else are we to describe the you know, the something like the raid on Harper's Ferry, or the other slave revolts that you've written about, as an attempt to storm heaven from hell itself?
Like the essence of light and darkness, and an exploration of the limits of both, and the utilization of both of these conceptually, is something that I take up very seriously when I talk and I write about mining. Because there's this something that I've always seen is this, like, the struggle for power and energy has always possessed this really important descriptive character. In my book For Repeater, the central argument that I'm trying to make about the functions of history as illustrating struggles such as these, through a film, a German expressionist film called Al Gol, which is about this star. It's like the star. Al Gol, as we know, for a long time, I guess it was thought to have been a single star, but it's actually a system of stars that move but in our position on Earth and its position, their position in the sky, the way that they move, they obscure themselves. And in this film, there's this idea that basically a star god, a star being, visits a German miner and gifts him a schematic for unlimited energy. There's a long love story that goes throughout it that could be more central, that maybe should be more central to my reading, but it's not. What I'm most interested in is this relationship between that which seems most obscure and the furthest from in the bottom of a mine, versus sort of something that emits so much energy in the sky that we can see it from Earth, but that even as such, it doesn't appear the way that we think that it does. That it's not just that they speak to one another, as we see in certain sort of elements, like certain elements of new historicism or whatever, but that they're actually intimately connected to each other through that point of production. And that, like, and here is a little passage that I have. The minor struggle against forces that invade and maim the body, for example, is an expressed range of dark and light in the human subjectivities, not just in the most literal sense, though such relevant are the ways miners' attempts to see in the dark have caused injury or death. For example, miners used to use oil-based lights that would cause problems, but as an articulation of social brutality that lies at its most fundamental and central places. It is not easy to consider the ways production of energy is contingent upon new historical formations and ritualistic human sacrifice, yet undeniable are the numerous ways this practice is revealed without being named. Perhaps this inability to give proper name and shape to this violence suggests a more fundamental characteristic than one may think.
You make an incredibly compelling point, and I think there's a modern we were talking about this just before we started recording, and now I'm going to spoil it for you. But in Roberto Bolaño's 2666, they are essentially the book itself is kind of 5 interlinked novellas, what was going to be 5 novels published, one every year. Bolaño wrote the book knowing that he was dying, and he wanted these novels to be published one a year for 5 years to provide for his family. But they're published as one, and they're these interlinked stories about the town of Santa Teresa, which is based on Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican-Texas border. And the 4th section is called The Part About the Crimes, and is based on the femicide in Mexico, where hundreds of women of all ages have been brutally murdered. And they're listed, the crimes are listed in this kind of almost dispassionate way, this or very forensic, like a police report or an autopsy report. And at the same time, the rest of the kind of world of these novels continues to kind of go outwards, and it becomes kind of exhausting to sit with. Bolaño said that, like, this was his vision of hell. This was his just kind of ritualized, systemic, grinding violence that's connected to these larger systems that seem almost impossible to, like, it's connected to things like to the drug trade, to the violence of borders, to the violence of neoliberal capitalism that sees Mexican women particularly as a source of cheap labor that can work in factories and be exploited. And reading the novel is to kind of read modernity, knowing that life, quote unquote, continues as normal, whatever that might mean. But at the same time, it's almost like you watch action unfold on 2 screens simultaneously. And on one, it's like people meet and have conversations and fall in love and, experience. And on the other is just a seemingly endless litany of kind of violence that is just documented so exhaustively that you realize that, it is the closest thing to hell. Hell is not elsewhere. Hell can be made just as easily here. And the kind of troubling thing, the kind of really morally, the kind of really disturbing thing is the extent of our own implication within that, right? Same as with those miners that were kind of sent under the ground.
Yeah, you're embroiled and embedded in that. That's what I mean. That's where the sort of purpose and function of alienation comes in. As a, like, alienation is, it's amazing how such a sort of like succinct concept is able to so totally and fundamentally describe large portions of human experience and capitalism in particular. That there are like these like assertions of totalizing meaning and these ideological impulses that describe themselves as fundamental and ultimately characteristic of human subjectivity, but ultimately what they're doing is obscuring themselves as a sort of like a preserving function. And then so on the one hand, you have the inability for so many to articulate their own position, and on the other hand, you have the dearth of countervalence. I think it's, I think that's what keeps us so distant, and I think it makes us feel smaller and separate from one another in a way that the like utmost poverty of our contemporary moment to continue unabated, or in fact to smugly and self-satisfactorily or whatever declare itself having ended things for the positive.
Yeah, we've all become like Mephistopheles from Faust, right? Why this is hell, nor am I out of it, right? Like, yeah, it's, this is right. There's the kind of that's the one option, is this kind of like ironic recognition of like, oh yeah, we are embroiled in it, and there is a sort of like deep drive to just sort of naturalize it. And you're right, it does make us feel kind of alone. And I think this is why, in a way, your focus on kind of like resurrection, on this idea of a kind of Christian critique of the Christian heaven, is so important, because what it does is allow for there to be a genuine historical record of when moments could have been different, when there was a chance to break out of hell, and which is it's sort of like what do we need if not like a Virgil to kind of use the analogy from Dante, right? This idea of there's a moment in the Inferno, I can't remember exactly where they come to the gates of the city, and Virgil in the damned, the city of the damned, and Virgil says to Dante to take heart of hope, rest for a moment, just stop. And it's like there's something incredibly sort of beautiful about this idea of a kind of poetic lineage that Dante both instantiates and inserts himself into, but also as reader, as kind of participant within that, you end up in this kind of like trans-historical moment of, the dead reach out to us. I mean, this is a kind of very, very kind of quintessentially Gothic thing, right? Which is that the dead never lie quietly in their graves. And in fact, if the present is something fundamentally incomplete, then why would they? And in fact, the way out is only made together rather than in isolation.
Something really important in the capturing of, like, we have a memory problem in our contemporary moment, and it's depoliticized. Like, there's this like honest, like genuine, I think very simple potential for recapturing of spirit in let's just very simply say like a working class spirit that is countervalent to capitalist hegemony and offers a better that offers a true demystification of our present while sort of projecting into the future. And it's not all in, but it's such a big part of it is in the way that, like, in the past, working class movements have been able to use our ability to articulate memory and to mourn it, on the one hand, as a sort of self-defeating and thus ultimately self-preserving coping mechanism, but then on the other hand, as a way of articulating exactly what you just the sort of Gothic element of that which you just exactly of all working class living, and of the sort of the various hauntings of the potential for something different.
Well, do you want to, as we kind of wrap things up, do you want to just talk a little bit more about the two books that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, on the one hand, there's a new series that's coming out from Zer0 Books that I think people are going to be interested in and excited about, that examines Utopia and attempts to sort of articulate new ways of thinking into utopia as an idea in many ways that, like we've talked about on this show. And it's on the one hand a book about the revival of a spirit of utopia, and on the other hand about posing that idea in the way that we have on the show as this. It's about the sort of inherently contradictory premise of our present. It argues that we live in a profoundly theological world filled with quote unquote secular, to quote our friends in Acid Horizon, fascist nerds, who are another book people should read. It's coming out from Repeater. Who are attempting to offer you so much interconnectivity and so much quote unquote imagination, and it's all speculative and none of it is real. And in fact, it's the mind through which we should be thinking through the present is less interested in these sort of empty promises of liberal capitalist utopias, but instead about that which is not yet, and sort of the unfolding of something new via hope's militancy, via the sort of the rising of a social body, as we discussed today, as well as something we didn't discuss quite as much today, which is thinking through the future as a form of madness, and how what that particular category of madness and the experiences within that have to tell us about the types of confrontations that are necessary for our current moment. That's the part I'm probably most excited about. For Repeater, I'm working on a longer treatment that's less oriented toward like political theology and is more strictly about history and how we write it. That is influenced especially by Benjamin, and attempts to use him to articulate a kind of countercurrent in the analysis of history. And there's a chapter about mining, there's a chapter about Spartacus, all kinds of goodies. What did I miss?